Welcome to this week's episode of the PS We Expire podcast. Today on this episode, I am sharing with you the third pillar of resilience. So this is the third episode in our 3-episode series on how to be resilient, how to develop that muscle of resilience, and how to use the really hard things that happen in our life to compel us to create a life that is full of meaning and purpose, how to not crumble under the weight of the hard challenges, but to alchemize them into creating a full and meaningful life. So thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of the PS We Expire podcast. I am so happy that you are with me today. I'm feeling like a buzz of excitement and also a little bit nervous to bring this episode to you today, because it's a topic that it's a difficult pill to swallow. Really, it is. It's this topic of personal responsibility. And as over the last 2 episodes, I've talked about the pillars of resilience, how we become more resilient people in the face of really hard circumstances and challenges in our lives. I think that this one is the cornerstone, really. Is it possible for it to be a cornerstone and still a pillar? I don't know. The metaphor is breaking down, but I'm happy to share this with you today. And I hope that right at the outset, you can hear what I think is probably the most important prerequisite to this conversation, that this conversation around personal responsibility is not the same as blame. Taking responsibility of your life, of your actions, of your thoughts, and your behaviors is not about placing blame anywhere. It's really about looking at what you've got and deciding to do something with it. It's making a choice. This conversation around personal responsibility introduces again into our lives what it means to be an autonomous person. You may find that although this pill is kind of hard to swallow, it also will be one of the most empowering messages and mindset shifts for you in your life. What I want to caution you about right out of the gate is that you do not listen to this episode with ears for another person. I remember sitting like in church or Bible study years ago and like having these thoughts crop up of like, oh yeah, like I know who needs to hear this message. And this is so common, even outside of the church space. This is so common with like quotes that you see on Instagram or a YouTube video that you see. And especially when it comes to something like how to behave in relationships, where you perk up and you think, yes, like I know that I want my husband to watch this. I know I need to send this to my friend, or, maybe if you're not as passive aggressive as that, and you just think to yourself, like, I really wish so-and-so could hear this message. I need you to set aside all of that right now, because that's kind of like, it'd be like listening to this episode on personal responsibility and thinking about it for someone else is kind of like standing at the starting line. And when the gun goes off, running in the opposite direction. You're running backwards in the race instead of forwards. So this is about turning your attention to yourself, turning the gaze inward, and understanding and embracing where this message resonates for you, not to shame or blame, but as the seeds of tremendous personal growth. One of my I remember reading one of the Ramona books when I was a kid. I loved those books so much. If you haven't read those, I highly recommend them. I have my daughter read them, the Ramona Quimby books. And in one of them, I remember that she had like made this crown out of these burrs. So like those little sticky weeds that like have the hooks on them, and she connected them all together and made a crown for herself. And if I'm remembering correctly, there had been this ad, during the time that Ramona was growing up, that like talked about like, oh, the devil made me do it or something. And then that was what she said when she talked about like making this crown and getting it stuck in her head and getting all stuck into her hair and having to have her hair cut off, was this like idea of like, the devil made me do it. And that is like such a good like snippet of what we do so frequently when it comes to personal responsibility. When we think about like taking responsibility for our behaviors, there can be this tendency to like shift the light away from us and be like, the devil made me do it, or my circumstances made me do it, or so and so made me do it, or that, you know, especially like you see this with little kids. I do this with my children a lot where, you know, one of them will say, the other one hit me. And I always like to ask, well, what came before that hit? You know, because there's always more to the story. So this idea of embracing personal responsibility is really about being brave to understand like how I've contributed to all the circumstances that are in my life right now. Every situation that I'm in my life right now was a choice. Maybe not consciously, you know, it may be as a result of our childhood programming, but nevertheless, if you are an adult, you have contributed to the circumstances that you are currently in. Choosing the path of radical responsibility, again, is not taking the blame for circumstances that are outside of your control. So, one of the most obvious personal experiences that I can share with you that has to do with circumstances that are completely outside of my control that I will not take blame for is that I have a daughter that had a genetic disorder that resulted in disability and death. Now, Annie's diagnosis and the circumstances surrounding her diagnosis, her disease, and her death, those are not my fault. And I really had to get to a point where I, number one, accepted the circumstance, even though it was outside of my control, and ask myself the question, what am I going to do now? That is where personal responsibility lives. It's when you're able to differentiate between the things that you have control over and the things that you don't have control over. And many times when we get fixated on the things that we cannot control, we can get stuck. You know, we can get stuck ruminating and focusing on the things that we don't have control over. So this may be even for some of you like a chronic illness, or this may be for some of you a relationship that's in your life that you really wish wasn't in your life. You know, this may be a tumultuous relationship with parents, you know, as you don't get to choose your family of origin. You don't. So being able to differentiate between the things that you have control over and the things that you don't have control over. And then when you can stop focusing on the things that you don't have control over, this is where personal responsibility really kicks into high gear. And this is where it's really exciting. It is a choice to look at where you're at without judgment, without hiding, without excuses, and making a choice to take responsibility for your outcomes. So there's 3 places where I want to talk about personal responsibility and how it can show up in really practical ways. The first way is in our personal relationships. Personal responsibility in our relationships is so difficult. It can be so difficult. I think that there's probably nothing more difficult than a relationship with a significant other. So whether it's your partner or your spouse, because you're doing so much of life with that person, and it can be really, really difficult to turn the lens towards ourselves and see how I'm contributing to any relational dysfunction or unease or conflict. But again, it's like asking the main question of like, what do I have control over? And as I cautioned you in the intro to this episode, you can't listen to this episode thinking I need so-and-so to listen to this. I need my spouse to listen to this, because you're missing the point immediately. Taking personal responsibility in your relationship is about understanding that there are always 2 sides to every story, and the only side of the story that you have control over is yours. If there's something in your relationship that you don't like, that you don't like how it's going, you don't like how maybe it's gone for a long time, and you're finally admitting that you're not okay with those or you want it to be different, then you start to get to ask yourself these exciting questions about, okay, how do I get to contribute to making it different than it currently is? And the reality is that you don't need both people to buy in. You don't have to have both people committed to making positive change in order to make positive change. So much of the problems that we have in our relationships are because we have unspoken expectations of the other person. So we have ideas about how that person should behave, how that person should respond, how that person should think about life, how that person should formulate their beliefs, how that person should treat us. We all have expectations about how that should go. And very infrequently are we very good at communicating those to that other person. And I'm not talking about ultimatums because I don't think that it's healthy in a relationship to say, you have to do this or else. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is collaborative efforts between you two to create a life that you both are excited about. And even though I did say there only has to be one person who's buying into this idea of taking responsibility in the relationship, I mean, ideally, both people would want to contribute to changing a relationship for the better. But regardless of that, you have the power to shift things in your relationship. What things have I blamed on the other person without acknowledging where I contributed? That might be around things like people walk all over me. I think that this happens a lot in friendships. This happens a lot in service communities. This happens a lot within family structures where, like one person is kind of like the unspoken designated person to, always host Thanksgiving or always take care of elderly parents or whatever. There are these unspoken agreements all the time. When we think about these unspoken agreements and you ask yourself, okay, where am I culpable for these patterns continuing to happen? I think a lot of times it boils down to our unwillingness to have uncomfortable conversations. It's our unwillingness to establish boundaries. It's our unwillingness to tell someone how their behavior really affected us or how we felt about what happened or what we're going to expect differently the next time. And this is a skill. I mean, if you're not good at having hard conversations, like that is okay because I don't think that that's something that we're taught. I don't think that we're taught how to have all those uncomfortable feelings welling up as we're telling someone something that's, really difficult or puts the relationship at risk or, feels like, are they going to still love me if I say this to them? So we're not very adept at having hard conversations, and that's totally okay. And where personal responsibility steps in is it says, "Okay, I'm not super good at having these hard conversations, so I'm going to learn how to have hard conversations. I'm going to study up on how to do that. I'm going to learn some techniques from really good communicators. I'm going to maybe bring in somebody to mediate conversations, hard conversations within my family or within my romantic relationships. So that might be a therapist or a counselor. This is about finding the places where you do have choice and saying, okay, like I'm not okay with things continuing to be the way that they are. And instead of just shutting yourself down or becoming passive aggressive, this is about choosing in those moments, like I'm going to do something different. I'm going to make some choices that I feel good about, that I feel comfortable with, that I know are going to contribute to changing things in the way that I need them to be changed. So, in that example of like people walk all over me, you can hear how, in even just that phrasing, that people walk all over me, there is this like energy of being a victim. Like, I don't have any control over people walking all over me, people assuming that I'm going to do these things, people continually asking me to do these things, And what I want to suggest and encourage you to do is anytime you feel that energy of feeling like a victim in your circumstances, I want you to shift that just enough where you can say, okay, how am I contributing to this problem or this pattern being perpetuated? This is going to be a game changer in your relationships. When you stop looking for the ways that the other person is screwing up or not meeting your needs or whatever, and you start asking questions about how am I going to get my needs met? How am I contributing to the problems in my relationship? And how am I going to change things on my end for the better? I wasn't going to share this, but I will share this anyway. That a really helpful kind of like 4-step process for me when it comes to being able to voice your needs in relationship is number one, you have to get really, really clear on what that need actually is. So sometimes we don't do the work of slowing down enough and being introspective enough to really understand what we want and what we need. So the first step is to get really clear on what we need. The second step is to make sure that we clearly communicate that to the parties that are involved. Making sure that the way that you're talking about it is the way that it's being received and understood. That's your responsibility to make sure that other person is really understanding and hearing what you're saying. Okay, and number 3 is if the behavior or the need, if the behavior doesn't change and the need is not met from that other person, then you get to decide if that need is really important to you or if it's not important to you. If you decide that it's not important to you, you need to let the other person off the hook. If you decide that it is important to you, you need to find another way to have that need met. So a really simple example of this is, oh man, something like even, divvying up household chores. Like there was a time, especially when my kids were little, that I was drowning in like household responsibilities, like between just the energy that is required to keep little people alive, to keep them from harming themselves, and then also just like keeping up with like the daily tasks within the household with the dishes and the laundry and then all the things that needed to be cleaned all the time that were extra messy because my little mess makers were always around. When I knew that I needed help with household work and I communicated that clearly, came up with a plan, and when that didn't change long term, I had the choice of just continuing to be like pissed about it and, upset that I wasn't getting the level of support that I was asking for. And I did do that for a while, became really passive aggressive and, would be just really angry about all the things that I felt like I was doing on my own, which was not true. That's another thing that blame will do is it will make you blind to the places where that other person is contributing. Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but so when things did not change to the level that I was hoping and expecting them to, and I decided that that was important for me to have help with some of those tasks, I hired someone to help out like once a month with just some of like the deep cleaning things. So that's just a really simple example of understanding like where I actually had power to do something about my circumstances. I had zero control over my husband's behavior. Like I could have complained, I could have berated, I could have, done all these things to try and like get him along to that. But if it wasn't internally motivated by him to do that, then I was just going to continue to create conflict in our relationship. So I decided, okay, what thing do I have control over? Just me. And if that's a need that I really need met, then I'm going to find another way to get that taken care of. This is the beauty of personal responsibility is you let other people off the hook. You let other people off the hook. And then you get to decide if there is something in your relationship that is really important to you and that other person either is incapable or unwilling to meet that need, the personal responsibility comes when you get to decide if you want to continue to be in that relationship. This can even be, this isn't just with a romantic partner, this can be with parents, This can be with friends. This can be with, spiritual leaders in your life or whatever. This is you understanding that you have so much choice. You have so much choice whether or not to continue relationships with people. But I highly recommend that you don't just like quiet quit your relationships, but that you develop the skills of having hard conversations, making your needs known, and then taking responsibility for the things that you actually have control over. So that's the first thing. So in our relationships, what things do I have control over? And to stop shifting blame to other people. Take responsibility for your actions, for your patterns, etc. The second area is within our mental health. I think I'll tie together the mental and physical health because they're so closely intertwined. So if you are struggling with your mental health, what brought you to the point that you're at now has many factors at play, some of which you are responsible for and some of which you are not. So that's the first point that I want to make. To flesh that out a bit more, your responsibility now is to address those things. So many people go through life feeling like they are a victim of their mental or physical struggles. And I understand, especially with something like a chronic illness, whether that is a physical or mental chronic illness, how exhausting and like debilitating that can feel, to feel like you don't have any control over those things. Personal responsibility says, okay, in light of what this reality is, what am I going to do? So in light of the reality that I struggle with anxiety, if I'm going to continue to be in the space where I am feeling like, like, why do I struggle with anxiety? For me, this sucks, whatever. Sometimes I do feel like that. Like I'm happy to say that, but I try to not stay there because I shared this in the last pillar of resilience that our brain uses so many calories just in thinking. And when we realize that, when we get in the swirl of thoughts, particularly around things that we don't have control over, we're wasting precious energy when we could be spending it on things that we do have control over. So this is where things like becoming a real advocate for your mental and physical health comes into play. So this may be things like, okay, I know I'm struggling with these things. Some of these things are outside of my control. And what I'm going to do about it is I'm going to find a therapist. I'm going to, try XYZ. If you are wanting to choose a more nutritious eating habits, maybe it's keeping a food journal. Maybe it's making sure that you don't drive a certain way on the way home because you're going to drive past that fast food restaurant that you consistently go to. This is the awareness of, I have so much control over what to do in my life. And the more that we get trapped in the spiral of thinking like, I don't have a choice here, the less we're going to look for the places where we do have a choice. There are so many anecdotes and tips and tricks and how-tos that are floating around out there when it comes to, well, pretty much anything, relationships, mental and physical health, whatever. There are so many people that are willing to tell you what to do and how to do it. And I think that that is fantastic. I'm so glad that there are so many tools at our disposal to learn how to do these things. The personal responsibility comes in for you to actually try them on and see if they work for you. Right? So this is us adopting the identity of a scientist to go to work on discovering what works for ourselves and what doesn't. Like, we cannot outsource a meaningful life to anybody else. Personal responsibility is about understanding, like, I am the only one that knows what's going on in here, in my body, in my brain, in my mind, in my heart. I'm the only one that understands that. And to try and outsource the health and wellness of myself as a holistic person to anybody else is a fool's errand, because nobody else is going to care as much as you do, because nobody else is feeling the illness that you are, the chronic pain that you are, the mental anguish that you are, the emotional pain that you are, the trauma that for up until now maybe has been unaddressed in your life. No one else is going to advocate for you. You have to do that for yourself. And if nothing else, if nothing else in what I've said resonates with you, this is what I want you to hear, is that it is your not just your responsibility, but it is your right to have a life that aligns with your highest good. It's your right. It is your right to not continue to be stuck in these patterns and these habits and just feel like for years and years and years, why can't things be different than they are? And maybe this will be the key for you to unlock choice. For those of you that are watching, I've got this little tattoo right here that's a key. Well, and if you're not watching, I just told you what it is. I've got this tiny little, like 1-inch tattoo of a key on my wrist. And it is my reminder to myself that the key to unlock the life that I want is me. And I understand that in a hyper individualistic society that we live in, Western cultures, there is this idea that, I got to pull myself up by my bootstraps and I have to be independent. And, we take real pride in being hyper independent individuals. And that is not what I'm talking about at all, because we are social creatures. We absolutely depend on the people that are around us and the people that support us. There's no getting around that. The personal responsibility comes into play when we say, I get to choose who those people are. I get to decide how I'm spending my time. I get to decide the things that I'm thinking about. I get to decide the inputs that I'm bringing into my life. I get to decide how I'm spending time scrolling on my phone. I get to decide those things. And, there's a lot of conversations around like, how much does free will actually exist? And I don't need to like get all philosophical and like address those things. But I want to ask you the question, like, what things have you been outsourcing in your life that it's time to take responsibility for? And not responsibility in a heavy, shame-filled way, but a responsibility in a way that is full of possibility, that is full of curiosity, that is just like brimming with, ooh, I can't wait to like try new things and see what's next and find the things that I haven't even thought about yet that bring so much life and satisfaction and fulfillment to my daily experience. Personal responsibility isn't about this heavy weight of everything is my fault. Personal responsibility is awareness that we have the power and capacity for great change and creation. I just like got goosebumps as I'm talking about this. It's the power of creation. It's the power of intentional creation in our lives. I hope that this conversation around personal responsibility is helpful to you, that you came away from this conversation with, again, not a sense of like overwhelm or dread, like, it's all my fault. That might happen as you start to really investigate things from a place of integrity and honesty. Sometimes that happens when you're addressing things you haven't addressed in a long time, and that's totally okay. But really, the sense that I hope that you're coming away from this conversation is, I can't wait to see what's possible. Okay, that's all I've got for today. But before we go, P.S. We expire.